We often imagine the story of our species as a relentless, outward-moving frontier, a series of clean migrations that replaced what came before, leaving the past behind like a shed skin. In this narrative, the archaic is something we grew out of, a primitive shadow eclipsed by the light of modern expansion. But in the Bay of Bengal, on a string of islands isolated by rising seas and deep trenches, that logic begins to fail. The Andaman Islands represent more than a geographic anomaly. They are a fracture in our understanding of how populations persist. For decades, the people of these islands were framed as living fossils, a term that is as scientifically vacant as it is rhetorically convenient. It implies a people frozen in time, untouched by the churn of history. The genetic reality, however, is far more complex and far more unsettling. It suggests that the signal of our origins was never fully replaced by the noise of civilization, and that within the genomes of the Andamanese lies a ghost, a genetic signature that doesn't just predate the island's settlement, but appears to belong to a human lineage that science cannot yet fully name. The map of humanity wasn't written in a lab. It was carved by the sea and the stone. This is Helix Horizon, where we trace the code that refuses to stay still. To understand the Andamanese is to first strip away the romanticism of the isolated tribe. Isolation, in a biological sense, is rarely absolute. It is a matter of degree, a statistical slowing of the clock. When we look at the broader expansion of Homo sapiens out of Africa, we generally follow the southern dispersal route, a coastal migration that hugged the shores of the Indian Ocean roughly 60,000 to 80,000 years ago. Most of the populations that participated in this journey eventually merged, collided, and were overwritten by later waves of Neolithic farmers and Bronze Age expansionists. Their original signatures were diluted into the vast, homogenized pools of modern Eurasia. But the Andamanese remained on the periphery of these demographic storms. Because they did not adopt large-scale agriculture and remained geographically buffered by the Andaman Sea, they preserved a high-fidelity signal of that first deep-time migration. They are not primitive. They are a rare point of temporal continuity in a world defined by turnover. However, when geneticists began sequencing the genomes of the Onge and the Jarawa, two of the island's indigenous groups, they found something that disrupted the standard model of dispersal. While their DNA confirmed they were descendants of the early Homo sapiens who left Africa, there was an unexplained surplus of genetic variation. There was a shadow in the data. Statistical modeling revealed that a significant percentage of their ancestry comes from an unknown ghost population, a group of hominins that diverged from the main human line before the ancestors of modern Asians and Papuans split. This isn't the familiar Neanderthal or Denisovan admixture found in Europeans or Oceanians. This is something else. It is a biological legacy of a human relative that met our ancestors in the forests of Southeast Asia, contributed to the gene pool, and then vanished from the fossil record, leaving its only surviving testament in the blood of islanders who stayed behind. This discovery forces a reevaluation of the replacement theory of human history. We are accustomed to thinking of the world as a series of empty rooms that our ancestors walked into and occupied. Instead, the Andamanese genome suggests the rooms were already inhabited, and the modern human identity is actually a mosaic of integrated lineages. The Andamanese are not a window into a pure past. They are a testament to a specific kind of survival, the ability of a small population to maintain a distinct biological signature while carrying the weight of an extinct relative's DNA through tens of thousands of years. This is the threshold where cultural identity and genetic reality diverge. While their culture is a masterpiece of local adaptation to the rainforests and reefs, their genes are a deep storage archive
of a broader, lost chapter of the human odyssey. What scientists expected to find was a simple story of a bottleneck, a small group of founders becoming more uniform over time due to genetic drift. And while the signs of a bottleneck are certainly there, reflected in the low genetic diversity typical of island populations, the presence of this archaic signal complicates the narrative. It means the ancestors of the Andamanese were not traveling alone through a vacant landscape. They were moving through a world teeming with other ways of being human. The islands became a sanctuary not just for a group of Homo sapiens, but for a specific genetic mixture that was being erased everywhere else on the mainland. The sea did not just isolate them, it acted as a filter, protecting this ancient complexity from the simplifying forces of the continental migrations that would follow. The persistence of this archaic signal leads us to a fundamental question of evolutionary mechanics. Why did this specific signature survive here while it was buried or bleached out elsewhere? The answer lies in the concept of selective pressure and the unique ecological constraints of the Andaman archipelago. On the mainland, the arrival of the Neolithic, the transition to settled agriculture, triggered a demographic explosion. When populations expand rapidly, they tend to homogenize. Dominant lineages sweep across the landscape, and the subtle, localized variations of earlier hunter-gatherer groups are overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the new genetic arrivals. But the Andamanese remained outside this cycle. Their survival was predicated on a finely tuned relationship with a specific tropical environment that did not support large-scale farming. Consequently, the massive turnover events that redefined the genetics of India and Southeast Asia simply stopped at the shoreline.
This lack of turnover is often misinterpreted as stasis. To the untrained eye, a population that has maintained a similar hunter-gatherer lifestyle for millennia appears unchanged, but biology never stands still. The Andamanese have undergone intense local adaptation, particularly through a process known as phenotype-environment matching. Their small stature, often categorized under the problematic label of negrito, is not a relic of an ancient miniature human race. Instead, it is likely a result of the island rule, a biological phenomenon where large bodies are selected against in resource-limited or closed environments. Genetics tells us that these physical traits are likely a relatively recent evolutionary response, not an ancestral condition. It is a striking example of how a population can be genetically ancient in its lineage, yet biologically modern in its adaptations. As we move from the physical to the molecular, the data reveals a profound lack of the markers associated with the great migrations of the last 10,000 years. In almost every other corner of the globe, the genetic landscape is defined by the Great Expansion. Whether it was the Indo-European horsemen or the Austronesian voyagers, these groups left a trail of specific haplogroups that serve as a biological shorthand for their movement. In the Andamanese, these markers are conspicuously absent. They represent a rare null result in the history of human migration. They possess a high frequency of mitochondrial haplogroup M, a lineage that is deeply rooted in the initial exit from Africa. While M is found across Asia, in the Andamanese it exists in unique indigenous branches like M31 and M32 that have been evolving in situ for perhaps 30,000 to 50,000 years. This deep temporal continuity creates a paradox for our understanding of human identity. We are used to defining ourselves by where we came from and who we conquered. We build identities around the idea of the pioneer, but the Andamanese identity is built on the concept of the refuge. Their existence challenges the idea that progress is a universal human drive. From an evolutionary perspective, their refusal to change, culturally and technologically, was not a failure to advance, but a highly successful strategy for long-term stability.
While empires on the mainland rose, overextended their resources, and collapsed into genetic chaos, the Andamanese maintained a steady-state existence that outlasted the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and the Age of Discovery. This is where the story stops being about a remote island population and starts being about the threshold of human resilience. If the Andamanese carry a ghost DNA that has vanished everywhere else, it implies that the modern human genome is a graveyard of lost possibilities. We are the survivors of a grand simplification. Most of the diversity that characterized our species 100,000 years ago is gone, pruned away by the success of a few specific groups. The Andamanese are one of the few remaining branches that managed to escape the shears. They remind us that the standard human genome we study in labs is actually a very recent, very specific version of the human story, one that has been heavily edited by the rise of civilizations. However, the Andaman Shadow is currently facing its most significant threat, and it isn't biological, it's the collision of deep time with the modern world. When the British established a penal colony on the islands in the 19th century, they didn't just bring soldiers and prisoners, they brought pathogens. The Great Andamanese, a collection of tribes that once numbered in thousands, were nearly extinguished by measles, syphilis, and influenza, diseases their isolated immune systems were entirely unprepared for. This historical tragedy provides a brutal lesson in the cost of continuity. The isolation that preserved their unique genetic signature also made them biologically vulnerable. The protection of the sea turned into a trap once the barrier was breached. Today, the Jarawa and the Sentinelese represent the last flickers of this ancient signal. The Sentinelese, particularly, remain one of the most isolated groups on Earth, famously resisting all contact with the outside world. This resistance is often framed in the media as primitivism or hostility, but through a genetic and historical lens, it looks more like instinctive preservation of a stable system. They are the final guardians of a biological archive that has been lost everywhere else. Their shadow is not a lack of light, but a presence of a different kind of history, one that operates on a scale of tens of thousands of years rather than centuries. This persistence of biological signature raises a provocative question about the nature of human success. In our standard modern framework, we equate success with expansion, the ability to occupy more territory, extract more energy, and build more complex hierarchies. But the Andamanese provide a counter-narrative of success, measured by equilibrium. By remaining small and specialized, they avoided the boom and bust cycles that have characterized the last 10,000 years of continental history. They are a case study in what happens when the signal of a founding population is not drowned out by the noise of subsequent migrations. This isn't a lack of history, it is a different frequency of history. When we analyze the ghost DNA found in their genome, we are looking at a fundamental mechanism of human evolution: introgressive hybridization. For a long time, the dominant view of human origins was the recent out-of-Africa model, which posited that modern humans replaced all other hominins without interbreeding. We now know this is incorrect. The Andamanese evidence suggests that as Homo sapiens moved through the corridors of South and Southeast Asia, they encountered relict populations of archaic humans, perhaps late surviving Homo erectus, or a yet undiscovered cousin of the Denisovans. These encounters weren't just competitive, they were reproductive. This Andaman Shadow is the evidence that the ancestors of the islanders not just passed through the landscape, they absorbed it. The implications of this extend far beyond the Bay of Bengal. If a population can carry the genetic legacy of an extinct human relative for 50,000 years in relative isolation, it suggests that our own genomes are likely far more crowded than we realize. Every modern human is a walking palimpsest, a document that has been written over, erased, and rewritten. The difference is that in most of us, the original text is so fragmented it is nearly impossible to read. In the Andamanese, the first chapter is still legible. They are the baseline against which we can measure the sheer scale of change that the rest of humanity has undergone. This brings us to the tension between cultural identity and biological reality. Today, the surviving Andamanese face the pressure of integration, a euphemism for the final erasure of their distinct way of life. When a culture is lost, we lose a library of local knowledge, a specific way of perceiving the world. But when a unique genetic lineage is subsumed into a larger population, something else happens. A specific evolutionary experiment comes to an end. The Andamanese have spent thousands of generations refining a biological and cultural toolkit for survival in a very specific niche. To force them into the modern world is to collapse a bridge to our own deep history that can never be rebuilt. Ultimately, the story of the Andaman DNA is not a story of them, an exotic exception to the human rule. It is a story of us. It reveals that the human journey was never a straight line from primitive to advanced. It was a messy, branching, and often repetitive process of movement, encounter, and persistence. The shadow in their DNA is a reminder that we are a composite species, born from a world that was once far more diverse than the one we inhabit today. We are not the inevitable result of progress. We are the winners of a demographic lottery, and the Andamanese are the last witnesses to the world before the numbers were drawn. As we look toward the future of genetic archaeology, the Andamanese remain a central enigma. Every new sequence of their DNA provides more resolution to the map of our origins, yet every answer seems to push the horizon of our ignorance further back. We are beginning to see that the ghost in their genome might not be the only one. Across the islands of Southeast Asia and into the highlands of New Guinea, other shadows are appearing, other signals of humans we never knew existed, preserved in the blood of those who lived on the edges of the world. If the Andamanese are the keepers of a lost human signature, what other ghosts are currently hiding in the DNA of populations we have long considered settled? If the map of our past is still being redrawn by the survivors of the periphery, what does that say about the stability of the identities we claim today? The resolution of the Andamanese genome doesn't just clarify a regional history, it shatters the central metaphor of the human family tree. We are taught to visualize evolution as a series of clean bifurcations, one branch splitting into two, distinct and diverging. But the Andaman Shadow suggests a different geometry, a lattice. This is a model where lineages diverge only to reach back across the void, exchanging information before drifting apart again. The presence of that archaic ghost signal in the Onge and Jarawa proves that our ancestors were not a single monolithic wave of modernity. They were a fluid, hybridizing force that absorbed the biological innovations of the environments they entered. This realization forces us to confront the instability of the term human. If the Andamanese carry the legacy of a hominin that had been evolving independently in Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, then modernity is not a biological finish line we all crossed together. The Andaman signal is a reminder that there were multiple ways to be human, multiple paths through the Pleistocene, and that the version of humanity that currently dominates the globe is merely the one that happened to be the most expansionist. The people of the Andaman Islands didn't fail to build empires. They succeeded in maintaining a specific biological and ecological frequency that empires, by their very nature, must destroy. As we refine our ability to sequence ancient proteins and degraded DNA, we are finding that the periphery is often where the most important information is stored. In the center of the world's great landmasses, the noise of the last 5,000 years, the migrations, the plagues, the industrial revolutions, have effectively overwritten the deep time record. To find the original signal, we have to look to the places where the expansion lost its momentum. The Andaman Islands, the high valleys of the Altai Mountains, and the deep forests of the Congo Basin are the biological hard drives of our species. They hold the data that the rest of us have deleted in our rush toward the future. This brings us to a final, inescapable irony. We are currently using the most advanced technology humanity has ever developed, genomic sequencing, high-performance computing, and isotopic analysis, to study a people who have spent 60,000 years rejecting the very concept of that technology. We are looking into their blood to find a version of ourselves that we lost. The Andamanese are not behind us in time, they are ahead of us in terms of endurance. They have survived the rise and fall of every civilization in recorded history. They have survived the shift from the Paleolithic to the Space Age without losing their core signal.
But the question remains, what happens when the signal finally fades? As the last isolated groups are drawn into the global network, the Andaman Shadow is being diluted. The unique genetic architecture that preserved the legacy of an unknown human cousin is being merged into the massive uniform pool of the 7 billion. This is the final threshold of the human story, the transition from a world of many distinct local human histories to a single, globalized biological event. The Andamanese teach us that identity is not a static inheritance, but a balance between what we carry and what we allow to change. They are the last witnesses to a planet that was once a mosaic of different human types, a world where the other wasn't just someone from another tribe, but potentially someone from another species. As their signal weakens, we are left with a haunting realization about our own origin. If the code for our extinct relatives is still alive in the Andamanese, then perhaps no human lineage is ever truly gone. They are merely waiting to be decoded. If a single island chain can hold the ghost of an entire lost human species, what does that say about the massive, unexplored genetic territories of the world's most isolated highlands and deep-sea coastlines? Is it possible that the modern world is still sharing the planet with shadows we have yet to name?